extremity to which the town was reduced, without sufficiently considering whether he would be really able to fulfil his promises. At any rate, these were the promises that he made, and as soon as the treaty was duly executed, the gates of Acre were opened to the conquerors, while Saladin himself broke up his encampment on the mountains and withdrew his troops farther into the interior of the country. Although the treaty was made and executed in the names of both the kings, Richard had taken into his hands almost the whole conduct of the negotiation, and now that the army was about to take possession of the town, he considered himself the conqueror of it. He entered with great parade, assigning to Philip altogether a secondary part in the ceremony. He also took possession of the principal palace of the place as his quarters, and there established himself with Berengaria and Joanna, while he left Philip to take up his residence wherever he could. The flags of both monarchs were, however, raised upon the walls, and so far Philip's claim to joint sovereignty over the place was acknowledged. But none of the other princes or potentates who had been engaged in the siege were allowed to share this honour. One of them, the Archduke of Austria, ventured to raise his banner on one of the towers, but Richard pulled it down, tore it to pieces, and trampled it under his feet. This of course threw the Archduke into a dreadful rage, and most of the other smaller princes in the army shared the indignation that he felt at the grasping disposition which Richard manifested, and at his violent and domineering behaviour. But they were helpless. Richard was stronger than they, and they were compelled to submit. As for Philip, he had long since begun to find his situation extremely disagreeable. He was very sensitive to the overbearing and arrogant treatment which he received, but he had either not the force of character or the physical strength to resist it. Now, since Acre had fallen, he found his situation worse than ever. There was no longer any enemy directly before them, and it was only the immediate presence of an enemy that had thus far kept Richard within any sort of bounds. Philip saw now plainly that if he were to remain in the Holy Land and attempt to continue the war, he could only do it by occupying an altogether secondary and subordinate position, and to this he thought it was wholly inconsistent with his rights and dignities as an independent sovereign to descend. So he began to revolve secretly in his mind how he could honourably withdraw from the expedition and return home. While things were in this state, a great quarrel, which had for a long time been gradually growing up in the camp of the Crusaders, but had been restrained and kept, in some degree, subdued by the excitement of the siege, broke out in great violence. The question was, who should claim the title of King of Jerusalem? Jerusalem was at this time in the hands of the Saracens, so that the title was, for the time being at least, a mere empty name. Still, there was very fierce contention to decide who should possess it. It seemed that it had originally descended to a certain lady named Sibylla. It had come down to her as the descendant and heir of the very celebrated crusader named Geoffrey of Bouillon, who was the first king of Jerusalem. He became king of Jerusalem by having headed the army of the Crusaders that first conquered it from the Saracens. This was about 100 years before the time of the taking of Acre. The knights and generals of his army elected him king of Jerusalem a short time after he had taken it, and the title descended from him to Sibylla. Sibylla was married to a famous knight named Guy of Lusignan, and he claimed the title of King of Jerusalem in the right of his wife. This claim was acknowledged by the rest of the Crusaders so long as Sibylla lived, but at length she died, and then many persons maintained that the crown descended to her sister, Isabella. Isabella was married to a knight named Humphrey of Huron, who had not the strength nor resolution to assert his claims. Indeed, he had the reputation of being a weak and timid man. Accordingly, another knight named Conrad of Montferrat conceived the idea of taking his place. contrived to seize and bear away the Lady Isabella, and afterward to procure a divorce for her from her husband, and then, finally, he married her himself. He now claimed to be King of Jerusalem in right of Isabella, while Guy of Lusignan maintained his right to the crown still continued. This was a nice question to be settled by such a rude horde of fighting men as these crusaders were, and some took one side of it, and some the other, according to their various ideas on the subject of rights of succession or their personal partiality inclined them. Now it happened that Philip and Richard had early taken opposite sides in respect to this affair, as indeed they did on almost every other subject that came before them. Guy of Lusignan had gone to visit Richard while he was in Cyprus, and there, having had the field all to himself, had told his story in such a way, and also made such proposals and promises, as to enlist Richard in his favour. Richard there agreed that he would take Guy's part in the controversy, and he furnished him with a sum of money at that time to relieve his immediate necessities. He did this with a view of securing Guy as one of his partisans and adherents in any future difficulties in which he might be involved in the course of the campaign. On the other hand, when Philip arrived at Acre, which it will be recollected was some time before Richard came, the friends and partisans of Conrad, who were there, at once proceeded to lay Conrad's case before him, and they so far succeeded as to lead Philip to commit himself on that side. Thus the foundation of the quarrel on this subject was laid before Richard landed. The quarrel was kept down, however, during the progress of the siege, but when at length the town was taken, it broke out anew, and the whole body of crusaders became greatly agitated with it. At length some sort of compromise was effected, or at least what was called a compromise. But really, so far as the substantial interests involved were concerned, Richard had it all his own way. This affair still further alienated Philip's mind from his ally, and made him more desirous than ever to abandon the enterprise and return home. Accordingly, after the two kings had been established in Acre a short time, Philip announced that he was sick and unable any longer to prosecute the war in person, and that he was intending to return home. When this was announced to Richard, he exclaimed, "Shame on him, eternal shame, and on his kingdom, if he goes off and abandons us now before the work is done." The work which Richard meant to have done was the complete recovery of the Holy Land from the possession of the Saracens. The taking of Acre was a great step, but after all, it was only a beginning. The army of the Allies was now to march into the interior of the country to pursue Saladin, in hopes of conquering him in a general battle, and so at length gaining possession of the whole country and recovering Jerusalem. Richard therefore was very indignant with Philip for being disposed to abandon the enterprise, while the work to be accomplished was only just begun. There was another reason why Richard was alarmed at the idea of Philip's returning home. "He will take advantage of my absence," said he, "and invade my dominions, and so when I return I shall find that I have been robbed of half my provinces." So Richard did all he could to dissuade Philip from returning, but at length, finding that he could produce no impression on his mind, he yielded and gave a sort of surly consent to the arrangement. "Let him go," he said, "if he will, poor man. He is sick, he says. I suppose he thinks he cannot live unless he can see Paris again." Richard insisted, however, that if Philip went, he should leave his army behind, or at least a large portion of it. So Philip agreed to leave 10,000 men. These men were to be under the command of the Duke of Burgundy, one of Philip's most distinguished nobles. The Duke, however, himself was to be subject to the orders of Richard. Richard also exacted of Philip a solemn oath that when he had returned to France, he would not in any way molest or invade any of his, that is Richard's, possessions, or make war against any of his vassals or allies. This agreement was to continue in force and to be binding upon Philip until 40 days